My name is Lauren Mitchell, and I'm 30 years old. On the day I thought would be the happiest of my life, I stood in a white dress, the lace brushing against the polished wooden floor, as 100 eyes turned toward me. Jason. My Jason smiled at me from across the room, the man who had promised to be my anchor in every storm. Guests clapped, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the air. By every outward measure, it was perfect. But there was a hollow silence that no violin or toast could cover up. My family's seats, those front rows reserved for the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, remained completely empty. Not one of them came. Not my mother, not my father, not even my sister. I remember gripping the knife with Jason as we cut the first slice of cake, our photographer capturing smiles that weren't entirely real. Because while everyone else celebrated, inside me was a well of grief I couldn't ignore. How do you explain to a room full of cheering guests that your own blood chose absence over presence? That the people who raised you decided someone else's party mattered more than your vows? The sting wasn't new. All my life I'd learned how to live with their neglect, how to mask disappointment behind a polite smile. But that night, the wound reopened in the most brutal way. And if you've ever felt that kind of betrayal, you know it cuts deeper than any stranger ever could. Family isn't supposed to do that. I'll be honest with you, part of me wanted to drop the knife right there and run to collapse under the weight of what was missing. But another part of me, the part Jason loved, stood straighter. Because if I couldn't have the family I was born into, maybe I could have the family I chose. And before I dive into this story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Have you ever been abandoned by the very people you thought would never leave? Because this isn't just about me, it's about every single person who's ever been told they weren't enough, every child overshadowed by a sibling, every bride or groom who looked out on their big day and saw empty chairs where their family should have been. That was me, Lauren Mitchell, 30 years old, married, yes, but with a heart that still carried the scars of being unseen. And that night, as the candles flickered and the wine poured, I felt a truth rising in me. This story wasn't just about a wedding. It was about what happens when the people you trust most strip you of belonging and how you claw your way back to define family on your own terms. So let me take you back long before the cake and the music and the silence. Let me tell you why those seats were empty and how the pattern had been set in stone years before. Because the truth of why nobody from my family came to my wedding didn't start that day. It started decades earlier in a house where love was conditional and where one child's spotlight always left the other in shadow. I wish I could tell you that after the ceremony, after that first slice of cake, I forgot about those empty chairs. But the truth. They haunted me like ghosts at the table. Every cheer, every toast, every laugh carried an echo of absence. And then right in the middle of the reception, my phone lit up in the pocket of my dress. 36 missed calls, a single message from my mother. We need to talk, now. Imagine standing in the spotlight of your wedding surrounded by joy and realizing your family has been desperately trying to reach you, not to celebrate, not to say they're sorry for missing the most important day of your life, but because of something else entirely. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. The questions piled up faster than I could process. Was someone hurt? Why now after ignoring me for months? Why today, of all days? But to really understand the weight of that message, you need to know what came before it. You need to know why my family wasn't there in the first place, why those calls were like salt in a wound that had been bleeding since I was a child. I grew up in Ohio, in one of those quiet suburbs where the lawns were trimmed evenly and neighbors waved at each other while taking out the trash. From the outside, we looked picture perfect. My mom, Evelyn, loved her holiday decorations. My dad, Daniel, wore his weekend barbecue apron like a badge of honor, and my younger sister, Harper, 3 years my junior, was the sunshine of the house. Blonde curls, dimples, a voice that carried across a room. Harper was the kid you couldn't help but notice. Ballet recitals, violin solos, theater auditions, if it sparkled, she was in the middle of it. And my parents. They adored her for it. Me, I was the quiet one. The kid who stayed up late with math problems spread across the kitchen table, who won science fairs with poster boards nobody in my house even bothered to look at. When I came home clutching an acceptance letter to an advanced science program in high school, my mom barely glanced up from pinning Harper's costume. "That's nice, honey," she said. "Leave it on the counter so your dad can see later." Later never came. Meanwhile, Harper took third place in a local dance competition that same week, and my parents whisked us off to dinner, champagne glasses in hand, to toast their little star. I sat at the table stirring my pasta, wondering how you celebrate bronze but not brilliance. And this wasn't a one-time slip. It was the pattern, the rhythm of my childhood. My achievements were footnotes. Harper's were headlines. When I walked across the stage at my high school graduation, my parents weren't in the audience. Harper had a recital. Mom hugged me later and said, "You understand, right? This is really important for her future." I understood, sure. I understood that I was invisible. By the time I reached college, I stopped fighting for their attention. I stopped calling home as often, stopped expecting them to notice birthdays, milestones, or the nights I cried into my pillow, because it felt like I'd been born into the wrong family. And yet, even after years of disappointment, some tiny, foolish part of me clung to hope. Hope that someday, one day, they'd finally look at me and see more than Harper's shadow. That's why their absence at my wedding hurt more than I can explain. It wasn't just that they missed a party. It was the culmination of decades of being overlooked, erased, set aside. And now here they were, blowing up my phone, demanding my attention on the very day they had refused to honor me. Before I continue, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If you've ever been treated like the second choice, like your victories weren't worth celebrating, you know how deep that scar runs. And if you're nodding right now, if you've ever sat in a room full of people and still felt invisible to the ones who mattered most, you're not alone. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt overshadowed by someone in your own family? I read every story. Because together those stories remind us that neglect isn't normal and silence isn't love. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe, not just because it helps the channel, but because I promise you more stories that expose the hidden wounds families leave behind and how we fight to heal them. Because the truth is, this story isn't just about a wedding. It's about what happens when you grow up invisible, when you're forced to measure your worth in shadows, and what happens when the lies finally unravel. And trust me, the unraveling hadn't even begun. I used to think childhood memories were supposed to feel warm, like sunlit afternoons, or the smell of cookies fresh out of the oven. Mine felt more like standing behind glass, watching everyone else laugh and clap for my sister while I pressed my hands against the barrier, desperate to be let in. My parents didn't mean to be cruel, at least that's what I told myself growing up. But cruelty doesn't always come in shouts or punishments. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the way your victories are brushed aside, as if they were accidents, in the way your name is forgotten, when the spotlight is pointed somewhere else. Take Harper, my younger sister, 3 years younger but treated like the crown jewel from the day she was born. Blonde curls, big brown eyes, a smile that could disarm strangers. She was the child everyone wanted to photograph, the one teachers remembered, the one neighbors gushed over. When Harper won her first dance medal, my parents threw a party in the living room, inviting neighbors to see the ribbon pinned proudly to her chest. When I won a statewide math competition that same year, my certificate ended up tucked under a pile of mail on the kitchen counter. It didn't stop there. When I was 15, I was chosen to represent my school at a regional science fair, an honor that meant months of preparation and late nights. I begged my parents to come watch me present. That morning, as I laid out my poster boards, I looked around the hall and saw other kids' families setting up cameras, clapping, cheering. My side of the aisle was empty. My mom had texted that Harper had a last-minute recital. "Good luck, honey. You'll do great." That was it. I still won second place that day, and I still walked off the stage into silence. It became a rhythm I couldn't escape. Harper performed, my parents beamed. I succeeded. My parents nodded absently. The message was clear. Harper mattered. I didn't. Do you know what happens when a child grows up starved of recognition? You stop expecting it. You teach yourself not to crave applause. You learn how to celebrate in private quietly, because if you don't, the emptiness swallows you whole. By the time I hit high school graduation, I had perfected the art of pretending. My parents weren't there again. Harper had a showcase and they couldn't split themselves in two. They asked me to understand, and I did. But I also realized something important: understanding doesn't erase pain. That was the night I decided to build walls. I told myself I didn't need their approval. I told myself grades and scholarships were enough, that someday when I got out, I'd find people who actually saw me. But here's the dangerous part. When you've been invisible that long, you start to wonder if maybe that's what you deserve. And so I left for college with a quiet determination to succeed, to survive, and to stop begging for scraps of attention from people unwilling to give it. I threw myself into my studies, earned scholarships, made friends who clapped when I achieved something. And for a while, I almost convinced myself that was enough. But deep down, that little girl still lingered, the one who once held up a certificate at the kitchen table, hoping anyone would look up and say, "I'm proud of you." That's why the empty chairs at my wedding cut so deeply. Because they weren't just empty on that day. They had been empty my whole life. When people say family is everything, I want to ask them, what happens when your family decides you're nothing? Do you keep waiting for them to notice you? Or do you finally decide that being invisible to them doesn't mean you're invisible to the world? This is the question I carried with me, the question that shaped every choice I made after leaving home. And it's the question that would come crashing back when Harper re-entered my life in ways I never expected. Because favoritism doesn't just wound a child. It creates a fracture that grows deeper and more dangerous with every passing year. And one day that fracture explodes. And my wedding day. That's when it exploded. By the time I reached my 20s, you'd think I would have been numb to it all. After years of being second to Harper after graduation ceremonies, where no one came after achievements that gathered dust in drawers, while her medals gleamed on the living room wall, you'd expect me to stop caring. But that's the cruel trick of family wounds, they don't scar over easily. They stay tender, waiting for the smallest touch to reopen. And it reopened on my wedding day. As I sat at the reception table trying to focus on the speeches and laughter around me, I kept glancing at my phone. 36 missed calls. The message, we need to talk. Now. I wanted to ignore it, bury the phone under a pile of napkins, and lose myself in the moment. But the truth, a part of me still wanted to believe they finally cared. That maybe this was the moment they would tell me, "We're sorry. We should have been there. We see you now." But my gut told me otherwise. I remembered a night years earlier when Harper had been chosen for yet another showcase. My parents insisted the whole family attend, even though I had a college interview the very next morning. I begged them to let me stay home and prepare. "Don't be selfish," my mom snapped. "Harper needs us." Those words echoed in my ears now as I stared at the buzzing phone. So I did something I'd trained myself to do since childhood. I smiled. I turned the phone face down, clinked my glass of champagne with my husband, and tried to push the ache down into the pit of my stomach, where it couldn't ruin the night. But you can only bury pain for so long. After the last dance, when the hall was emptying and the cake had been boxed up, I finally stepped outside into the cool night air and listened to one of the voicemails. My father's voice clipped and cold. "You need to call us back. This is serious. Don't ignore us. No apology, no explanation for their absence, just urgency." And suddenly I was 15 again, clutching that science fair ribbon, waiting for applause that never came. What made it worse was that my husband, kind, patient man that he is, looked at me with confusion. "Do you want to call them back?" he asked gently. His family had been there all day, showering us with love and laughter, filling the gaps mine had left. He couldn't understand why my hands trembled as I held the phone. Because how do you explain to someone who's always been seen what it feels like to be invisible? I told him no, that I'd deal with it later, but inside I was spiraling. And here's where I need to pause and ask you something. If you were in my shoes, if the people who raised you ignored your biggest day only to demand your attention hours later, what would you have done? Would you have answered? Or would you have let the silence speak louder than words? Drop your answer below, because these are the choices that define us, and I know I'm not the only one who's faced them. That night I chose silence. I slipped into bed with my new husband, clutched his hand, and told myself tomorrow was a new beginning. That I'd built a new family of my own, one that actually cared. But morning came, and with it, a knock on the door that would unravel everything I thought I'd left behind. Because when family decides to reappear after years of absence, they don't come quietly. They come with storms. And this storm was just getting started. The pounding on the door jolted me awake before the sun had even climbed over the horizon. At first, I thought it was a dream, a leftover from the storm of emotions that had haunted me the night before. But then it came again, a steady, relentless knock that carried more demand than courtesy. My husband stirred beside me, confusion written across his face. I pulled on a robe and walked toward the door with dread tightening around my chest. When I opened it, there stood my mother. Not a smile, not even a strained congratulations. Just a glare like I'd broken some unspoken rule. Behind her, my father leaned against the car, his arms crossed, while Harper scrolled through her phone as if she were already bored. "Why didn't you call us back?" my mother hissed, stepping past me into the entryway. "Do you know how irresponsible you're being?" Irresponsible. That was the word she chose to use on the morning after my wedding, the one they hadn't bothered to attend. Not congratulations, not we're sorry. Just another accusation hurled like a stone. I wanted to scream, to demand why they had the audacity to show up now uninvited after years of dismissing me, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I asked quietly, "Why are you here?" My father's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You've been avoiding us, and there are things you need to take care of. Things you owe this family." It wasn't until later that I understood what he meant. But in that moment, I felt the same old tug-of-war inside me, the desperate little girl craving approval, and the grown woman who knew she deserved better. My husband stepped in, then his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Maybe this isn't the best time," he said evenly. "We just got married yesterday. Couldn't this wait?" The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's eyes narrowed at him like he was a stranger who dared to cross the sacred boundary of blood ties. "This doesn't concern you," she snapped. "This is family business." But it did concern him, because when you marry someone, their battles become yours too. And in that moment, I realized just how much he was willing to stand with me in the fire. I drew in a shaky breath and said something I'd never dared say before. "Then maybe I don't want to be part of this business anymore." The look on their faces was a mixture of shock and fury. Harper finally looked up from her phone wide-eyed like I'd just spoken the unthinkable. My father's jaw tightened. "You don't get to walk away. Not after everything we've invested in you." Invested, as if I were a stock they'd gambled on waiting for returns. And here's where I pause again for you watching this. Have you ever been told you owe your family something as if love is a ledger to be balanced? Because if you have, you know that crushing weight. Drop your story in the comments because I know I'm not alone in this. That morning, as the sun finally broke across the horizon, I closed the door in their faces. My hands trembled, my knees nearly buckled, but I did it. For the first time, I chose myself. But little did I know shutting that door wasn't the end. It was only the opening move in a much bigger game, one where secrets would surface, loyalties would be tested, and my definition of family would be torn apart all over again. I leaned against the wood after the latch clicked, my husband pulling me into his arms. "I've got you," he whispered. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. What I didn't realize yet was that belief would be tested far sooner than I ever imagined. For a few blessed hours after they left, the house was quiet again. Jason made breakfast pancakes because he knew they were my favorite, and we tried to pretend it was a normal Sunday morning. But even as syrup dripped down my fork, I couldn't shake the echo of my father's words. "You don't get to walk away." I wanted to believe I could, that by closing the door I had severed the cord tying me to decades of neglect. But family ties aren't cut that easily. They find ways to coil around your ankles, dragging you back when you least expect it. By afternoon, the storm rolled back, and this time not with knocks, but with messages. My phone buzzed endlessly, texts from my mother, guilt-laced voicemails from my father, and most surprising of all, an email from Harper. Her words were wrapped in sugar, but the venom seeped through. "You really embarrassed us yesterday. You think shutting the door makes you stronger? It just proves you're ungrateful. Mom and Dad sacrificed so much for us, and you repay them like this." Ungrateful. That word again. It had been my label since childhood. Anytime I wanted attention, I was selfish. Anytime I questioned why Harper got more, I was ungrateful. It was their trump card, one I'd swallowed until it lodged like a stone in my chest. Jason noticed my silence as I scrolled. "Don't let them bait you," he said softly. But my hands trembled anyway. Because deep down I was afraid he was wrong, afraid that maybe I was ungrateful. Afraid that maybe I didn't deserve the love he gave me so freely. That night, I stood at the bathroom sink, staring at my reflection. 30 years of being told I was second best. 30 years of wondering if maybe I really wasn't enough. But then another thought rose louder than the whispers of doubt. Why does love have to be earned? Isn't love supposed to be given? Isn't that what family is supposed to mean? And I'll ask you this, if you're still here with me, have you ever been labeled the ungrateful one, just for wanting the bare minimum of love and respect? Because if you have, you know the burn of trying to prove your worth while your heart begs for rest. Share it below because I promise this space is safe for that truth. The next morning, I decided to test my strength. I drafted a short reply to Harper. You chose not to be at my wedding. That hurt. I won't apologize for protecting my peace. I hovered over the send button for what felt like hours. My heart raced, my palms sweated, but eventually I pressed it. The fallout was immediate. My father called within minutes, his voice dripping with controlled rage. So this is what marriage has done to you. You're letting that man fill your head with poison. That man, as if Jason were some outsider tearing apart a perfect family. But maybe that was the moment I finally saw it clearly. My family wasn't perfect and Jason wasn't the poison. He was the antidote. The one teaching me how to breathe without asking permission. When I hung up, Jason wrapped me in his arms again. You don't owe them your peace, he whispered. And for the first time in 30 years, I started to believe him. Still part of me knew this wasn't over. My family had drawn a line in the sand. By refusing to step back into their control, I'd sparked something deeper. Something that would force truths into the light I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But ready or not, the storm was already gathering. 3 days after that email exchange, I thought maybe the storm had passed. I told myself my family would cool down, bury the conflict under silence, like they'd done 1,000 times before. But I underestimated how far they were willing to go to pull me back into their orbit. It started with whispers from extended relatives, an aunt calling to ask why I'd cut my parents off, a cousin messaging me late at night saying Harper told everyone I'd turned into a selfish recluse since marrying Jason. At first I brushed it off. Gossip dies quickly, I told myself. But then the stories twisted into uglier shapes, that Jason was controlling me, that I had shouted at my parents and slammed the door in their faces, that I was planning to abandon them in their old age. Each lie felt like a brick being stacked against me, walling me off from people I'd once trusted. And the cruelest part, they didn't even have to confront me directly. They just painted me as the villain to everyone else, and let the judgment flow back to me in poisoned echoes. I sat on the couch one night, scrolling through social media, my stomach sinking as I saw cryptic posts Harper had written. Funny how some people think marriage is an excuse to forget where they came from. Hundreds of likes, dozens of comments filled with sympathy for her. None of them knew the truth. Jason read over my shoulder, his jaw tightening. You don't have to prove yourself to them, he said. But my chest felt like it was caving in. Because what if their lies stuck? What if everyone believed Harper's version and my silence only made me look guiltier? That's the insidious power of manipulation. It doesn't have to be true to feel real. And maybe you've lived this too. Have you ever had someone twist your story so much that you barely recognized yourself in their version? If you have, you know how exhausting it is to keep carrying your truth in a world that rewards the lie. One evening as we ate dinner, Jason put down his fork and said, "You don't have to play defense anymore. Sometimes the strongest move is refusing to play their game." But how do you refuse a game when the players are your own parents and sister? When every lie feels like it chips away at your identity? I realized then that I had a choice. Either spend the rest of my life defending myself against stories I didn't write, or step fully into my own story, even if it meant walking away from theirs forever. That night, I opened my journal and wrote a single sentence: I am not the villain in my own life. It felt like reclaiming something they had stolen long ago. The next day, I posted a simple photo, Jason and I, smiling outside our new home. My caption was short: Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose you every single day. It wasn't a direct attack, but it was a declaration. And in that moment, I stopped trying to win their approval and started building something stronger, my own narrative. Of course, that choice came with consequences. My phone lit up almost immediately, calls from relatives, a furious voicemail from my mother. But for once, I didn't flinch. Because the truth was no longer theirs to twist. It was mine to live. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. If my family had been willing to smear my name in whispers, what came next would be far louder and far harder to ignore. I thought claiming my own narrative would quiet the noise. I thought that by standing firm, by telling the world that family is who shows up, not who shares your last name, the storm might finally settle. But instead, it only grew louder. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a text, a printed stamped letter with my parents' handwriting on the envelope. My stomach twisted before I even opened it. Jason sat beside me as I unfolded the pages, his hand brushing mine when he saw how badly I was shaking. The letter was brutal. They accused me of disrespect, of publicly humiliating the family with that social media post. My father wrote that my words were a knife to the heart, and that if I continued down this path, I would be cut out of the family entirely. My mother added her own flourish at the bottom. You'll regret this when you're alone. Don't expect us to be there when your so-called new family abandons you. It was signed not with love, but with finality, Mom and Dad. I couldn't breathe. My whole body trembled as I read and reread those sentences, the cruelty of them pressing into me like sharp stones. Jason took the letter, read it silently, then ripped it in half without hesitation. But I just sat there, frozen. Because even though their words were venom, a part of me still felt the sting of truth. What if they were right? What if I really would end up alone? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The image of my family laughing around the dinner table without me haunted me. The memory of every holiday where I sat at the kids' table, while Harper basked in the glow of adult conversation, replayed itself. But now I wondered, had I been fighting a battle I could never win? In the darkness, Jason whispered, "You're not alone. You'll never be alone as long as I'm here." And somehow that reminder kept me from breaking. Still, their words clung to me like shadows. And shadows have a way of creeping into every corner of your life. The next day, I took a walk through our neighborhood just to clear my head. That's when I ran into Mrs. Andrews, our elderly neighbor, who always waved when we passed by. She smiled, asked how married life was treating us, and then, almost casually, she said, "Your sister stopped by here yesterday. She mentioned you're having some family troubles." My heart sank. So it wasn't just letters and whispers anymore. Harper was carrying the story into the world, planting seeds wherever she could. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about family. This was about control. They couldn't stand that I had broken free, that I was building something outside of their shadow. And if they couldn't pull me back, they'd try to ruin me instead. Here's where I want to pause and ask you, if the people who raised you threatened to cut you off and smear your name, would you fight back, or would you let go completely? Tell me below, because I know this isn't just my story. Too many of us have faced this crossroads. That night, I sat down with Jason and told him everything. For the first time, I admitted out loud what I had only whispered in my head. Maybe it's time to walk away for good. Saying it felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying but also strangely freeing, because deep down, I knew something they hadn't realized yet. You can threaten someone, you can smear their name, you can even try to erase them, but once they decide to reclaim their freedom, there's no going back. And that decision was closer than I ever imagined. The decision to walk away wasn't as clean as I thought it would be. I imagined closing a door and finally breathing freely, but instead it felt like 100 doors slamming shut at once. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. Was it another accusation? Another threat? Or worse, silence? The kind that says you've already been erased. Jason urged me to ignore it all, but then something happened that forced the choice onto me in a way I couldn't ignore. One Saturday morning, a certified letter arrived. My stomach dropped the second I saw the official seal. I signed for it with shaky hands and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a notice from a lawyer, my parents' lawyer. They were threatening legal action, accusing me of slandering the family name, and hinting they might pursue financial damages if I continued publicly disparaging them. It was absurd. I hadn't named them, hadn't said anything except that family is who chooses you. But they wanted to make an example of me to scare me into silence. Jason read it, his face hardening. "This isn't about law, it's about intimidation," he said. And he was right. My parents didn't want money, they wanted obedience. But here's the thing about trying to control someone who's already tasted freedom: the leash doesn't fit anymore. That letter became my breaking point. For years, I'd swallowed the little betrayals, the missed birthdays, the favoritism toward Harper, the constant reminders that I wasn't enough. But seeing their threats in black and white made something snap inside me. I wasn't their child anymore, I was their target. That night, Jason and I stayed up late talking about what to do. And here's where I want to pull you in. If your family sent you a legal threat just to silence your truth, what would you do? Fight back in court, or cut ties completely and never look back? Drop your thoughts below, I want to hear how you'd handle it. We sat on our porch as the summer air hung heavy around us, and I realized I couldn't keep living half in and half out. Either I broke free completely, or I let them crush me. The next morning, I wrote a letter of my own. It wasn't to them, it was to me, a declaration that I would no longer be held hostage by guilt or blood ties. I wrote, I release myself from their control. I choose peace over chaos. I choose truth over fear. I choose family that chooses me. Folding that piece of paper and tucking it into my journal felt like closing a chapter I'd been trapped in for 3 decades. But I didn't stop there. I called a lawyer, my own this time. Not to sue, but to protect myself, to make it clear that if they escalated, I was ready. And for the first time, I felt something new: power. And yet power doesn't erase pain. That night, as Jason held me, I cried, not because I regretted my decision, but because I finally understood its cost. Walking away meant losing them for good. It meant that those empty chairs at my wedding weren't an accident. They were a prophecy. Still, there was a strange kind of relief in knowing the truth. They had chosen absence, control, intimidation. And I had chosen freedom. Little did I know their response to my silence would be louder than anything they'd done before. The smear campaign was only just beginning, and the next twist would test not just my strength, but my very identity. Silence, I learned, can sometimes be more dangerous than noise. After I sent no reply to their lawyer and refused to bend, my parents shifted tactics. They stopped sending me letters. They stopped calling. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd given up. But then the whispers began. It started small. A coworker pulled me aside one afternoon, a worried crease on her forehead. Lauren, someone told me you were cut off from your family because you stole money from them. Is that true? I froze. Stole money? I laughed at first, thinking it was some cruel misunderstanding. But the next week, Jason's friend mentioned that Harper had been talking around town telling anyone who would listen that I was unstable and that Jason should keep an eye on me. It was like watching a fire spread through dry grass. One spark, then another, and suddenly it was everywhere. I was being painted as the unstable, greedy black sheep who had turned her back on her loving family. The same family who hadn't even shown up to my wedding. Jason told me not to engage. But how do you sit back when your name is dragged through the mud? I felt cornered, furious, desperate to shout the truth. And yet every time I thought about posting more or defending myself online, I remembered the lawyer's letter. That's what they wanted, to bait me into giving them more ammunition. So instead I turned inward. I poured myself into work, into building a home with Jason, into surrounding myself with people who lifted me instead of tearing me down. But no matter how high I built my walls, the rumors seeped in like smoke through cracks. At church, at the grocery store, even in line at the coffee shop, I caught whispers, side glances, pity in people's eyes. And here's the part that stung the most: a small piece of me worried they'd won. Because the truth doesn't always matter when a lie is repeated often enough. One night, I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone when I stumbled across Harper's latest post. A smiling photo of her surrounded by my parents, captioned, "Some bonds can't be broken. Unlike others who abandon family for attention." I stared at that screen until my vision blurred. Abandoned family. Was that really how they saw me, as the deserter, as the villain? Jason took the phone from my hand, shut it off, and said, "They're building their own prison, not yours." But his words couldn't erase the ache. Because no matter how strong, you are being smeared by your own blood cuts deeper than anything else. And this is where I need to ask you, if the people who should have loved you most turned the entire community against you, would you fight louder, or would you retreat into silence? Comment your thoughts, because this crossroads nearly broke me. But in that breaking came a clarity I hadn't expected. I realized that their campaign against me wasn't just about lies. It was about erasure. They wanted to write me out of the story entirely. And the only way to counter that wasn't to shout it, was to live. To create a life so rooted in love, in truth, in chosen family that their narrative couldn't stick. Still, even with that resolve, I couldn't shake the dread that haunted me. Because deep down, I knew they weren't done yet. Families like mine don't simply let go. They escalate. And the next escalation would come not in whispers or posts, but in a public confrontation I never saw coming. The confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon in the most public way possible. Jason and I had gone into town for the farmer's market, a place I usually loved, full of fresh bread, handmade crafts, and neighbors greeting one another with smiles. For a few hours every week, it felt like community at its best. But that day, community became a weapon. I was browsing a stall of sunflowers when I heard my name. Lauren. I turned, and there they were, my parents and Harper, standing like a wall of judgment in the middle of the crowd. My heart dropped into my stomach. Before I could even respond, my mother's voice carried loud enough for every passerby to hear. There she is, the ungrateful daughter, pretending she's better than her own family. People turned, whispers buzzing immediately. My cheeks burned, and I forced myself to breathe steadily. Mom, this isn't the place. Oh, isn't it? She snapped. You've been dragging our name through the dirt for months, posting your little sob stories online, acting like you were abandoned. But everyone should know the truth. You abandoned us. The market had gone silent except for her words. I could see phones lifted discreetly, people recording. Harper folded her arms, smirking like a victor. My dad just glared at me, eyes cold and unwavering. Jason stepped forward, his hand brushing mine, but I shook my head. This was my fight. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said as evenly as I could, I told the truth. You didn't come to my wedding. You haven't shown up for me for years. That isn't abandonment, that's reality. My mother scoffed, her voice sharp as broken glass. Reality. The reality is you've always been jealous of Harper. You've always needed to play the victim because you can't stand not being the favorite. It was like she'd struck me. The same accusation I'd lived under my whole life now shouted for the world to hear. And the worst part. Some people in that crowd nodded as though they believed her. I wanted to scream, to list every slight, every birthday missed, every time Harper was chosen over me. But instead I felt something else rise, a calm, a clarity. You know what I said, my voice steady now. If being honest about my pain makes me the villain in your story, so be it. But I won't let you control mine anymore. You can call me ungrateful, you can call me jealous, but you'll never call me silent. The crowd buzzed louder, a mix of gasps and murmurs. My mother's face twisted with rage, my father's jaw tightened. Harper rolled her eyes, but for the first time, I didn't flinch. Jason squeezed my hand, then grounding me. And I realized something powerful. I wasn't fighting to win them over. I was fighting to free myself. As we walked away, I could hear my mother's voice still shouting after me, but it was faint compared to the pounding of my heart. Each step felt heavier, but also stronger, because in that moment, under the gaze of an entire town, I had spoken the words I should have said years ago, I will not be silent. And yet, as freeing as it wasn't the end. Public humiliation was their battlefield now, and they weren't done escalating. The next move would hit even harder because it wouldn't just be about words. It would be about taking something that mattered to me, something I never thought they'd dare to touch. After that showdown at the farmer's market, I thought I'd finally drawn a line thick enough that my parents and Harper wouldn't dare to cross it again. But toxic people don't stop. When you stand up, they adapt, and they hit harder. And this time, they aimed for something far more personal than rumors or public shaming. It began with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. Jason and I were sipping coffee in our kitchen when his phone buzzed. I watched his face pale as he answered, then turn red with anger. What do you mean the lease is in dispute? He snapped, gripping the edge of the counter. When he hung up, I felt dread coil in my stomach. What happened? They're challenging the lease on this house, he said slowly. Your father claims he helped co-sign the down payment as a gift, and now he wants it back, with interest. I nearly dropped my mug. That was a lie. Jason and I had saved every cent for this home. My parents hadn't contributed a dime. Yet, here they were trying to use the legal system to shake the very ground beneath our feet. We scrambled for paperwork, bank records, proof. Jason called our lawyer, who confirmed what I already suspected: this was a malicious tactic. They didn't expect to win. They just wanted to drag us through court, to drain us emotionally and financially until we bent under the pressure. And if that wasn't enough, Harper piled on. She posted vague updates online about how some people steal houses just like they steal attention, a dig obvious to anyone who followed the drama. I can't describe the weight of that month. Every knock at the door made my chest tighten. Every trip to the mailbox felt like opening a trap. Our home, our safe haven, suddenly felt invaded. Jason tried to stay strong, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. At night, we'd lie in bed in silence, both pretending to sleep while fear clawed at us. It was one evening while going through a stack of receipts at the kitchen table that I broke. I dropped the papers, buried my face in my hands, and sobbed. Why won't they just stop? Haven't they taken enough already? Jason pulled me into his arms and whispered, Because control isn't about enough. It's about never letting go. But listen to me, Lauren, we'll get through this. They can't win if we don't let them. Those words became my anchor. And slowly I realized something important. Every time my family tried to take something from me, they revealed how powerless they really were. Empty chairs at my wedding. It showed their absence more than my failure. Public shaming. It exposed their cruelty, not my weakness. And this lawsuit, it screamed desperation, not strength. Still, that didn't erase the pain. Nights stretched, long days blurred with stress. And though I held on to Jason's words, I couldn't shake the fear of what they might do next. Because if they were willing to weaponize my wedding, my reputation, and now my home, what was left. And here's where I want to pause and ask you, have you ever felt hunted, like someone who should have been your protector, turned into a predator? If so, what did you do to survive it? Share your story, because hearing yours might help someone else feel less alone in theirs. What I didn't know then was that survival would require more than endurance. It would require one last test, one last betrayal that would cut me to the bone. A betrayal that would finally force me to make the choice I'd been avoiding all along, to walk away completely or to let them destroy me. I thought I had braced myself for every trick, every cruel maneuver my family could pull, but nothing prepared me for what came next. The betrayal that carved deeper than any lawsuit or rumor. It happened on a rainy Friday night. Jason and I had just finished dinner when a sharp knock rattled the door. I opened it to find a courier soaked through holding a large envelope. I signed without thinking, my pulse already uneasy. Inside was a notice, a petition for guardianship review. I read the words again and again, not believing them. My parents were attempting to argue that I was emotionally unstable and unfit for independent living, and they were petitioning to have control over my assets. My stomach churned. It wasn't just about money anymore. They wanted to strip me of my adulthood itself, to brand me incapable of making my own decisions. Jason caught the paper as it slipped from my shaking hands. "This is insane," he muttered. But I could see the fear in his eyes, because even baseless accusations carry weight in the legal system. And suddenly the life I had built, our marriage, our home, our future, felt fragile like glass in a hurricane. Over the next week, their campaign escalated. Harper posted online that she was worried about her sister's mental health and hinted I was spiraling. My mother left voicemails dripping with faux concern. "Lauren, we only want to help. Everyone sees you're not coping. Maybe if you admit it, we can fix this together." It was gaslighting perfected, turning their abuse into proof that I was unstable. Neighbors began looking at me differently. One even asked if I was doing okay at home. The humiliation was suffocating. One night, sitting on the edge of my bed, I whispered to Jason, "What if they succeed? What if a court actually believes them?" He crouched down in front of me, holding my face in his hands. "Listen to me. You are not broken. You are not unstable. They are terrified because you've cut their strings, and this is the only way they know how to grab them back. We'll fight this, and we'll win." His words steadied me, but inside a new fear bloomed. This wasn't just about surviving their attacks anymore. It was about proving once and for all that I belonged to myself, that I wasn't theirs to control. And here's where I'll lean into you watching this. Can you imagine your own parents trying to erase your adulthood just to win control? It sounds unthinkable, but it happens. And when it does, the choice isn't just about fighting them. It's about deciding who you truly are without them. The weeks leading up to the hearing were brutal. Every day, more whispers, more posts, more pressure. My mother even showed up outside our house once, clutching a photo album, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to come back to the family. I nearly opened the door, nearly gave in to that old pull of guilt. But Jason's hand on my shoulder stopped me. When the court date finally arrived, I walked into that sterile room, shaking but resolute. Harper sat smug in the front row, my parents flanking her, whispering like conspirators. They truly believed they would win. But as I looked around that room, I felt something shift inside me. I realized this wasn't just a battle anymore. It was the last act of war. If I stood tall here, I would never bow again. And what happened in that courtroom didn't just decide the case. It shattered the last illusions I had about my family, and forced me to confront a truth I had run from for years. Because when the judge spoke, something happened that none of us saw coming. The courtroom felt colder than any winter I had ever known. I sat at the defendant's table, palms pressed flat against the polished wood to steady the tremors in my hands. Across the aisle, my parents and Harper whispered with their lawyer, their expressions smug as though victory had already been signed and sealed. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My chest tightened. I wasn't just fighting for my home or my reputation anymore. I was fighting for the right to exist as myself, unshackled from their grip. Their lawyer opened with venom cloaked in politeness. He painted me as a young woman spiraling into emotional instability, cut off from her family, isolating herself under the influence of an overbearing spouse. He referenced Harper's posts as if they were evidence-played voicemails from my mother, where she feigned concern and spun a story that made me sound fragile, broken, incapable of standing on my own 2 feet. For a moment, I felt like I was drowning in their lies. My heart pounded, my breath shallow, and then Jason's hand brushed mine under the table, anchoring me. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood and dismantled their narrative piece by piece. He presented bank records proving the house was ours, letters from colleagues attesting to my stability, and even a glowing evaluation from my supervisor at work. He argued that the very fact my family needed to fabricate such claims showed not my weakness, but their desperation. And then it was my turn to speak. I rose, legs trembling, but voice steady. I told the court about the empty chairs at my wedding, the years of exclusion, the smear campaign online. I admitted how much it had hurt, but also how I had built a life, my marriage, my career, my community without them. I am not unstable, I said, staring straight at the judge. I am free, and they cannot stand it. Silence swept the room. For the first time, my parents' faces flickered with doubt. Harper's smirk faltered. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped. The court sees no evidence of incapacity, he declared. This petition is denied with prejudice. His gavel struck sharp and final. I nearly collapsed with relief. Jason squeezed my hand, tears brimming in his eyes. Across the aisle, my parents froze their defeat, plain, their power fractured. Harper looked like she had swallowed glass. But as we left the courtroom, I knew the victory was more than legal. It was symbolic. This was the first time I had stood before them, not as their daughter desperate for approval, but as a woman claiming her own sovereignty. They couldn't take it from me, not with lies, not with courts, not with anything. And yet, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like mourning. Mourning the family I wished I'd had the love they could never give. As Jason and I walked into the sunlight, I realized that some ties don't unravel gently, they shatter. And once shattered, you can't glue them back together without cutting yourself on the pieces. That night, we sat in our living room, the legal papers stacked neatly on the coffee table. Jason turned to me and asked quietly, "So what now?" I looked around the home we had fought so hard to protect. For the first time, it didn't feel like a fortress under siege, it felt like ours. Safe, earned, defended. "What now?" I whispered back. "Now we finally live." But deep down, I knew one thing. Toxic people rarely walk away quietly. And though the courtroom had ended, one battle, the war wasn't truly over. The final reckoning still waited, the moment I would have to choose once and for all, whether to sever every tie that remained. The weeks after the courtroom victory should have felt like freedom, but instead they hummed with an uneasy quiet, like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept waiting for the phone to ring, for another envelope to arrive, for Harper's smug face to resurface on my feed. Every creak in the house made my body tense. After years of their manipulation, silence felt more dangerous than noise. One Saturday morning, as Jason and I planted tulips in the backyard, the storm finally broke. An email arrived from Harper. Its subject line read, "Final chance." My heart sank as I opened it. Her message was a poisonous blend of guilt and arrogance. She accused me of tearing the family apart and warned that unless I reconciled, I'd be forever erased. She promised my parents were willing to forgive if I admitted I was wrong, if I apologized, if I returned to my place. I stared at the screen, fingers frozen above the keyboard. A part of me still ached for their approval, still longed for a family who would choose love over power. But another part, the stronger part, knew this wasn't an olive branch. It was a leash. Jason leaned over my shoulder. "You don't have to answer," he said softly. But I did, not for them, for me. For years I had been reacting, defending, surviving. This time I wanted to end it on my terms. I typed, "I am not coming back. I am not broken. I am not yours to control. This is goodbye. My finger hovered for a moment before I pressed send. The release was immediate, like dropping a weight I had carried my whole life. The aftermath was brutal, but clarifying. My parents cut me off entirely. Relatives unfriended me, siding with Harper's narrative. Old friends connected to my family slipped away. But as the noise faded, so did the chains. I realized I didn't need their version of family anymore. I had one with Jason, with the home we built, with the garden blooming under our hands. And here's where I pause, looking straight into you, the one listening. How many of us stay shackled to people who wound us just because they share our blood? How many of us confuse control with love, guilt with loyalty? If you've ever felt that sting, you know the hardest freedom to claim is the one from those who raised you. That summer, Jason and I hosted a small gathering in our backyard. Just a few friends, laughter carried by warm air, fairy lights strung across the fence. For the first time in years, I felt whole. No whispered insults, no threats, no chairs left empty in silent protest. Only presence, only peace. As twilight deepened, I looked at the tulips we had planted months earlier. They stood tall now, bright against the darkening sky. I thought of the girl who once begged for scraps of love at her family's table, and I realized she was gone. In her place was a woman who had chosen her own worth, her own path. And maybe that's the real victory, not winning a lawsuit, not silencing the lies, but finally refusing to let anyone else decide who you are. So if you're still here with me, let me whisper this: don't wait for permission to be free. Claim it, own it, live it. And if this story resonates with you, share it, leave your thoughts, and join this community. Because none of us should walk through this kind of fire alone, and together we can turn survival into something stronger: sovereignty. When I look back now, it's almost strange to think how much space they once occupied in my mind, in my heart, in my choices. The battles, the tears, the endless tug-of-war for approval, it all felt like life or death at the time. And yet, here I sit years later, with the quiet hum of our home around me, realizing that none of it defines me anymore. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes softly, like the way morning light seeps through the curtains, steady and patient. That's how I began to notice it on mornings when I woke without dread, on evenings when laughter lingered longer than fear in the steady rhythm of a life that belonged only to me and the people I chose. I think of the tulips again, the ones Jason and I planted with dirt under our fingernails with no guarantee they'd bloom. But they did. They remind me that growth takes root in places you nurture, not in the shadows where you're starved. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: love that comes with conditions, ultimatums, or chains is not love at all. You deserve better. We all do. Sometimes the bravest act is simply choosing yourself again and again until the choice feels like home. So tonight, as I close this chapter for good, I do it with gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons, for the pain that became clarity, and for the strength I never knew I had. And if you're listening, still searching for that same strength, know this: you already carry it within you. You just have to decide to use it.